Okay, hi everyone. We're going to look now at chapter 5, which is basically following on from chapter 4. Chapter 4 is talking about the outbreak of World War II in Europe, and now we're going to fast forward to see how, after all that Germany did under Hitler to get involved in World War II, to start World War II with the invasion of Poland on 1st September 1939, followed by the British and French declaring war on Germany, on Hitler, 2 days later, on the 3rd. We're going to look and see what eventually led to Hitler being defeated. Okay, so moving on. Now, inquiry question for this chapter overall is: was the entry of the USA in 1941 the main cause of Germany's defeat in World War II? Okay, so in terms of the key words, we're looking at this factor, the entry of the USA in 1941 into the war. Alright, why 1941? Even though the war started in 1939, we will learn about that in a bit. Okay, but basically the question is asking, was this the main cause? In other words, there are other causes as well. What are some of these other causes? Okay, basically, of course, the given reason of this inquiry question is the entry of the USA into the war. On top of that, we have Germany's weaknesses and miscalculations, as well as resistance by other allies apart from the USA, which we will talk more about in a future lesson. Okay, today's lesson is in particular on the entry of the USA. Alright, so moving on. So what will we be covering in this particular lesson? Firstly, we'll look at the background behind the US involvement, and then how it was involved indirectly. Indirectly meaning the USA did not actually contribute troops in terms of actual physical fighting at the initial stages, which is why we talked about 1941 as the point of time when they were directly involved in World War II. Alright, what was the event? We'll talk about it in a while. So what's the background of this? Okay, basically, if you recall from chapter 1, right, this man who is President Woodrow Wilson of the USA, alright, he had proposed the formation of the League of Nations, and of course the League of Nations was eventually formed, but if you recall, the USA was never a member of the League of Nations. Okay, in fact, instead it harbored what we would call isolationist sentiments. Okay, we've talked about this before. What were the reasons for these isolationist sentiments? Okay, there are three of them. Firstly, okay, there were the effects of the Great Depression, and in fact of course, this Great Depression only took place in the late 1920s onwards, but economic effects, alright, basically kept the US in an isolationist point of view, right, because they wanted to focus on healing their own economy, their own economic recovery. So they thought that involvement in other countries' affairs would only make things more complicated for them. Okay, excuse me. Okay, secondly, of course, this we recall from chapter 1 that they were still recovering from the effects of World War I, which the US was involved in from a later stage, right? And this really got them thinking about how, okay, we really need to be isolated so that we don't get involved in the conflicts of others, because if you recall, the US was not actually involved in World War I at the start, but only got involved at a later stage after the Germans had basically excuse me, they had bombed, they basically had sunk some American ships, okay, which caused the US to get involved at a later stage, even though the war was fought pretty much entirely in Europe, okay, at this point in time. Anyway, thirdly, there also is a sense of geographical isolation. Now, this means that if you look at this map, okay, if you look over here, you can see this is the US, and where most of the action was going on, Europe is all the way over there, and they are separated by the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so the US felt that, well, see, that's all the stuff over there, why should we get involved, right? Which is precisely why, in the aftermath of World War I, there was a lot of anti-war sentiment, or rather desire for isolationism, because they did not want the US to get once again involved in affairs which don't concern them, because it's all the way on the other side of the pond, the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so for these reasons, the US had adopted a isolationist foreign policy. Okay, so In fact, there was something called the Neutrality Act, which was passed in 1937. Okay, and you can see from this cartoon what was the purpose. You know, neutrality means not taking sides, right? And so they say that they're going to provide all-out aid to our allies. But look at the direction of this ship. Okay, this is a Dr. Seuss cartoon. You can see this basically going around in circles, right? So even though they say, oh yeah, we provide all-out aid, but in the end, what aid is being provided? They're not providing it to anyone. Okay, so you can see the purpose of the Neutrality Act is really just for the US to stay out of other countries' business. Okay, let's talk about Dr. Seuss. You pay attention, he has some really interesting cartoons. We may come across more of them in the course of future lessons. Alright, so basically this Neutrality Act was passed in 1937 to ensure that the US would not become involved in a foreign war. Alright, because the US said, let's worry about our own affairs, don't worry about other countries' affairs. So what were some of these features? Okay, American ships were not allowed to transport passengers or materials to warring nations. So in other words, they couldn't indirectly aid a war effort. Okay, and in fact, even American citizens were not allowed to travel on ships to warring nations. So now we move on to the section on US indirect involvement. Now, for a start, can anyone tell who this is? Okay, I can envision all of your hands raised up in the comfort of your own homes, screaming, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Yes, and you are correct. He is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the USA. He was the president of the US between 1933 to 1945. Now, he today is regarded as one of the most influential, one of the most highly respected presidents and the best presidents of recent American history. Okay, so much so that if you go to the Washington DC today, the capital of the US, there is a FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial. You can see there, this is his name and title, and 1933 to 45. This is a statue of him with one of his many famous sayings, together with his constant companion. Okay, apart from his wife, there also Eleanor Roosevelt. There also was a dog, Fala, who was famous pet that he had, famous dog. But anyway, back to him a bit later. Basically, Roosevelt, after surveying the scene in the US, even though there was the Isolationist Act of 1937, okay, when he saw what had happened in 1939 with the start of World War II and the German invasion of Poland, followed by Britain and France declaring war on Germany, okay, he proposed something called the Cash and Carry Act. Now, literally, okay, because he still favored Britain and France over Nazi Germany, alright, even though he did not want to get involved directly in the war. So he basically allowed Britain and France to buy arms from the USA on what we call a cash and carry basis. In other words, they had to pay in cash for the whatever military supplies they get from the US, and added to that, okay, they had to settle their own transportation. They had to bring it there on their own. So in other words, there's no home delivery service, there's no payment on credit. Okay, so this was to provide some help to Britain and France, who so that they could deal with the war against Germany better. Now, however, okay, fast forward to March 1941, and the situation had changed. In spite of this aid, okay, the Lend-Lease Act was proposed as a way to enhance what was going on through the Cash and Carry Act. Why? Because Britain's resources were drained by 1940. Now let's look at a map. You can see Britain over here, the United Kingdom in blue, and there's the Soviet Union in blue. So these were the allies. All right. At this point in time, if you notice, France, which used to be or rather it was fighting with the British against Germany, actually had fallen to Germany by 1941. Okay, northern France was occupied by Germany, southern France, Vichy France, was under a collaborationist regime. Okay, but to cut a long story short, okay, Britain was left alone in the West as an ally in the fight against Nazi Germany. Okay, and the Soviet Union all the way on the other side. Okay, this took place after Hitler had broken the terms of the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact by invading the USSR, okay, betraying Stalin, and this made Stalin very cross. But anyway, so now at this point in time, US is all the way over here on the other side. Okay, onto the West, they saw that Britain needed help, otherwise they may be overwhelmed. So this is precisely what they did. Okay, the Cash and Carry Act was amended to something called the Lend-Lease Act, whereby the US could supply these things, food, weapons and equipment, to Britain and other countries where defense was seen to be important to US security. So in other words, not that the US was directly going to be affected, but the US saw that Britain needed help, right? Because if Britain were eventually to not be able to be defended properly and were to fall, the US security, American security, may be called into question. Okay. Later on, this Lend-Lease Act was extended to the USSR after Hitler had betrayed Stalin in June 1941, okay, with the launch of Operation Barbarossa. So basically, even the USSR, which ideologically was not aligned with the US, still the US was willing to provide aid to it in order to fight against Hitler and Nazi Germany. Excuse me. And so, importantly, okay, what was the refinement, the changes made from cash and carry? Now, payment for purchases could be deferred. In other words, they didn't have to pay up front, they could pay later. Previously, remember, they had to pay in cash up front. Okay, and now they didn't have to pay in cash. Alright, so basically it could be put on credit. Okay, and the Lend-Lease Act gave the Allies a fresh injection of supplies and resources which were needed to fight Germany. So this helped to strengthen the Allies at a time when they were in quite dire straits, as you could see in this map over here, right? Okay, so the US provided help, but did not, of course, end up fighting yet. Okay, but at least this was something which helped the Allies a fair bit. Okay, added to that, okay, Roosevelt also felt that the US should be the arsenal of democracy. Now, if you were to see there, you can see there, we must be the great arsenal of democracy. This is one of the sayings of Roosevelt, which was put in his memorial, which I talked about earlier. Okay, what does it mean? Well, those of you who are football fans, of which I am not one of them, you would know that of this club, Arsenal, and you can see here the symbol, right? I think they're called the Gunners. And so Arsenal basically means, okay, it's basically a storehouse of weapons, okay, to in the case of any need for these weapons. Alright, so basically the US should always be the arsenal of democracy, meaning they always should be able to provide military support, okay, military resources to democratic nations such as Britain, right? So that's why the arsenal for democratic nations in the fight against the Axis powers, through the provision of military supplies, okay? Therefore, this term. Alright, so that's what I said earlier, okay? The US increased aid to Britain after France fell to Germany in 1940. So after this, apart from the Lend-Lease Act, weapons as well, okay? The US provided further support to Britain in order to strengthen it, to be able to withstand the onslaught of Nazi Germany. And so, okay, they actually gave some old destroyers. These are battleships, okay, basically given to the British in their fight against the Nazi Germans, okay, in exchange for 8 naval bases that the British had in the Caribbean, okay, much further away from this where the action was taking place in World War II. Okay, now at the same time there were close bonds forged between the US and Britain. President FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, and Churchill frequently communicated with one another. Okay, so they were forming a very close relationship, even though strictly speaking, FDR and the US was not fighting against Germany. So in response to this, Germany and Italy joined Japan in something called the Tripartite Pact, because there's 3 of them, okay? So they committed to help one another politically, militarily, and economically. So, and on the other side of the equation, these of course eventually what we know as the Axis powers. Excuse me. So FDR also planned to expand the American military forces and also stepped up the process of rearmament. Again, even though the US was not directly fighting, okay, they were strengthening their military. Perhaps you could say that this was FDR preparing for an eventual American involvement. One day it would have to happen, especially if Britain were to be overwhelmed, okay? But in the meantime, okay, the US provided psychological support, and through this strengthening of its military also provided, this was a good psychological support, because at least the Allies knew that yes, okay, the Americans will be there if need be, right? And also material support. okay, in this manner, through not just through Cash and Carry Lend-Lease Act and through being the arsenal of democracy, all of this allowed the Allies to gain military superiority over Nazi Germany. So, how did Roosevelt decide to share with his people his views that basically perhaps it's time to end isolationism, or at least move towards the end of isolationism? Because as we could see from earlier, it seemed inevitable that the US would get involved, and in fact it was preparing to its military to get the possibility of getting directly involved in World War II. That means directly fighting against the Germans. Okay, so basically he came up, he basically shared his thoughts in fireside chats. Now, what are fireside chats? These basically are informal means by which Roosevelt could address his people. Now, back in the 1930s and 40s, television was not widespread, and certainly not the internet at all was not there as well. So radio was one of the chief forms of entertainment which a lot of Americans had, and so this was the best way for Roosevelt to talk to them. And so he basically shared with them his thoughts regarding why he believed that isolationism should come to an end. Now, I'm not going to read through this. You can of course just pause this video and read this at your own leisure. Okay, but basically what he's getting at over here, okay, is you see here it says that let us be done with both fears and illusions. Okay, let us calmly consider what we have done and what we must do. And what he was referring to was the previous American desire to remain apart from it all, right? Okay, that what they have done, and now he considers, he says that they did so because of their fears and illusions. In other words, it was not grounded in reality, and he was telling them that, hey, if you look at the reality of the situation, what we must do is to get involved. Alright, so okay, he convinced them to end this isolationism, which but he tried to convince them basically, and he was fairly successful at that, I must say, okay, to end isolationism. Alright, and so this basically would get more American support for Roosevelt's gradual move towards providing support for the Allies. And eventually, when the US did enter the war, okay, the American public was pretty much firmly behind it. Very different from how it is today when America gets into wars, but that's another story. Okay, so the US also provided help to the Allies, okay, by escorting Allied convoys at sea. Okay, after these convoys started to be attacked by German U-boats or untersea boats, basically these are submarines like this. Okay, and so the US Navy provided support, okay, to help prevent these Allied convoys. That means Allied, basically Allied military movements from one place to another at sea, okay, from being attacked. Okay, this enabled Allied ships to cross seas safely and therefore helped strengthen. That means that supplies, troops could be transported more safely. This, of course, would mean that the Allies would be less vulnerable to attack, and therefore their strength would be not as limited as it otherwise may have been. Okay. Now, in addition to that, okay, there also were economic sanctions, okay, or punishments on Axis powers. So there were resources such as iron, which were restricted, okay, to deprive the Axis powers of resources needed for the war. If you recall, Axis powers means Germany plus Italy and Japan. Okay, in fact, Japan, which had American assets, okay, that means they had financial their assets, they had money in the US, and their assets were frozen when they invaded Indochina in 1941. Indochina refers to what today we know as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Okay, this area was actually occupied by France at the time. But anyway, when Japan did this, okay, their American assets were also frozen. So in other words, this helped to limit the amount of financial supplies that the Japanese had. Okay, and these economic sanctions contributed to the weakening of the Axis powers as well, because now their supplies were drained. Alright, so this would then help to boost the Allied war effort. Okay, and as the Axis powers, their supplies were drained, this would weaken them further, okay, and eventually naturally contribute to their weakening to the extent that they were defeated in World War II.